In June 2011, two well-known drug traffickers operating within the UK's County Lines network suddenly disappeared after arriving at a remote farm in Cornwall. Their names were David Griffiths and Brett Flournoy. Both men were known for violence, had direct involvement in large-scale drug distribution, and were not the type to simply vanish without triggering immediate consequences in the criminal underworld. Their disappearance created an abrupt vacuum in the supply chain, followed by an unusual silence from associates who had previously relied on them. Telecommunications data later showed that both men's mobile phone signals ceased at the same time and at the same location: Sunny Corner Farm, an isolated property owned by Ross Stone. There were no CCTV recordings, no independent witnesses, and no emergency calls made after that point. The case was initially treated as a missing persons report. That classification did not hold for long. Background checks revealed that Griffiths and Flournoy were involved in a serious financial dispute linked to a £40,000 drug consignment that had gone missing. In the criminal environment they operated in, debts of that size were not resolved through silence or disappearance. They were resolved through violence. As investigators began linking the missing persons reports to known criminal associations, Sunny Corner Farm was no longer viewed as the men's last known location, but as the probable site of a double homicide. From that moment, the investigation shifted away from asking where the men had gone and toward a more decisive question: who killed them? And how did they believe they could get away with it? David Griffiths, age 35, and Brett Flournoy, age 31, did not enter the criminal world by accident. Both men came from environments where violence was structured, normalized, and directly tied to survival and status. Griffiths was born in Plymouth and pursued a mixed martial arts career at a modest level. He achieved no significant professional success, but the experience provided him with physical conditioning and a familiarity with confrontation that later proved useful outside the ring. After leaving competitive fighting, he relocated to Bracknell, Berkshire, where he became involved in drug trafficking, leveraging his reputation for violence to enforce compliance and maintain authority within illegal transactions. Despite being a father of three, Griffiths maintained two parallel lives, one as a family man, the other as an enforcer within the drug supply chain. Brett Flournoy presented a different but equally defined profile. Raised in Merseyside, he served 6 years in the British Army as a Royal Engineers soldier. After leaving the military, he transitioned into professional boxing, quickly establishing himself with 9 wins in 10 bouts, 4 of them by knockout. In 2010, Flournoy reached the final of the prizefighter light middleweight tournament, elevating his profile beyond local circuits. Outside the ring, Flournoy operated a public house in Birkenhead. Legitimate income, however, failed to satisfy his financial ambitions. Through connections formed during his military service and sporting career, Flournoy became involved in drug distribution, functioning primarily as a logistical intermediary, linking supply routes across Liverpool and northern England. Griffiths and Flournoy formed a partnership based on shared experience with violence and a mutual ability to assert dominance. Within the County Lines system, where relationships are governed by fear rather than loyalty, they developed a reputation as operators who were difficult to deceive or undermine. Griffiths handled access to high-purity cocaine, while Flournoy managed distribution channels and transportation routes. The network they operated within had historical ties to Irish Republican-linked groups, but functioned in practice as a profit-driven criminal organization focused on drug trafficking, territorial control, and enforcement through intimidation and violence. While neither Griffiths nor Flournoy occupied top leadership positions, their operational importance meant their disappearance would not go unnoticed. By 2010, both men had accumulated financial resources and a reputation that commanded caution from associates and rivals alike. In the criminal environment they inhabited, however, reputation was not a permanent safeguard. Its value depended on financial stability and the continued ability to control those positioned beneath them. It was at this point that an unresolved debt began to erode that stability, setting in motion the sequence of events that would ultimately result in both men's deaths. By late 2010, a critical instability emerged within the operations of Griffiths and Flournoy. A drug consignment valued at approximately £40,000 disappeared during transit. Responsibility for the shipment was attributed to Thomas Hay, a lower-level operative within the same distribution network. Hay, aged 26 and based in Huddersfield, had an extensive criminal history dating back to his early teens, including burglary, drug dealing, and repeated periods in youth detention. By the time of the loss, Hay was regarded as a reliable courier, tasked with transporting high-purity cocaine along international routes, including trips involving South America. The precise reason for the consignment's disappearance was never conclusively established. Whether due to negligence, theft, or interception was ultimately irrelevant within the operational logic of the network. The financial loss was assigned to Hay, who was then subjected to sustained pressure to compensate for the deficit. Griffiths and Flournoy employed established methods of control, threats, coercion, and escalating demands. Hay was ordered to undertake increasingly high-risk transport assignments, including trips to Brazil, with the objective of recovering or replacing the lost shipment. Each failure, delay, or explanation was treated as further defiance. The pressure extended beyond financial liability and became physical and psychological in nature. Threats were made against Hay and individuals close to him, reinforcing compliance through fear. Within this system, refusal was not a viable option. Ross Stone, the owner of Sunny Corner Farm, became involved during this period as an intermediary. Stone functioned as a storage and distribution facilitator for the same network and maintained a personal relationship with Hay. Observing the escalating pressure, Stone attempted to intervene, proposing mediation and delaying tactics in an effort to de-escalate the situation. These efforts failed. From the perspective of Griffiths and Flournoy, anyone connected to the missing funds, directly or indirectly, was considered responsible. Stone's involvement, rather than easing tensions, drew him further into the conflict. For Hay, the sustained demands gradually altered his perception of his position within the network. Prolonged pressure, combined with the realization that cooperation would not resolve the debt, transformed initial fear into calculation. At this stage, the dispute was no longer a conventional financial conflict. Hay understood that without decisive action, the likely outcome for him would be severe violence or death. By mid-2011, Thomas Hay no longer viewed the $40,000 debt as a problem that could be resolved through cooperation or negotiation. The continuous demands, repeated high-risk assignments, and ongoing threats led him to conclude that the network he served had no intention of allowing him to exit alive. According to later investigative findings, this period marked a shift in Hay's mindset from defensive survival to proactive action. Rather than attempting to repay the debt, he began considering how to eliminate the source of pressure. Within the logic of the criminal environment he operated in, this meant removing the individuals who controlled him. Griffiths and Flournoy were central to that pressure. They issued the orders, enforced compliance through threats, and maintained the stalemate in which Hay was trapped. In Hay's assessment, eliminating them would simultaneously erase the debt, end the cycle of coercion, and alter the balance of power within the network. The plan was not formed impulsively. Evidence presented at trial showed that Hay had considered the act over several weeks. He evaluated the victims' movement patterns, their level of caution, and potential locations where an attack could be carried out without outside interference. Sunny Corner Farm emerged as the optimal site. The location met all operational requirements. It was isolated, familiar to all parties, and owned by Ross Stone, a figure trusted enough not to raise suspicion. The farm had previously been used as a storage and meeting point, making the victim's presence there routine rather than unusual. Hay prepared the weapon in advance. He selected a 12-gauge shotgun, a firearm with high lethality at close range and well-suited to the confined environment of the farmyard. The choice indicated clear intent, not intimidation, not warning, but immediate fatal effect. On June 16, 2011, Griffiths and Flournoy arrived at Sunny Corner Farm expecting to resolve the outstanding debt. From their perspective, the meeting was another opportunity to assert control and apply pressure. There was no evidence to suggest they anticipated a lethal threat to themselves at that time. Hay, by contrast, had already determined that this would be their final meeting. Based on the reconstruction of events presented in court, as the victims entered the farmyard, Hay approached from behind or from a concealed position. No warning was given, no prolonged confrontation occurred, and there were no signs of a physical struggle prior to the shooting. The first shot struck Brett Flournoy, inflicting fatal injuries and causing him to collapse almost immediately. Within seconds, David Griffiths was shot a second time, sustaining wounds to the shoulder and head that resulted in death at the scene. The entire act was carried out in a brief time window, with the sole objective of neutralizing both victims before they could react or escape. There was no indication of hesitation, panic, or reconsideration at the moment the shots were fired. With 2 shots, the $40,000 debt ceased to exist in practical terms. However, the act created a new and more severe problem: 2 bodies at a location that Hay could not fully manage on his own. From that point onward, the incident ceased to be an isolated act of violence and entered a phase of systematic concealment. After the 2 shots were fired, Sunny Corner Farm ceased to be the site of a failed meeting and became the location of 2 deliberate homicides. Thomas Hay understood that the shooting itself resolved only the initial problem. The decisive factor in avoiding detection lay in how the aftermath was handled. Ross Stone was present at the farm at the time. According to later testimony, Stone did not participate directly in the killings, but was fully aware of what had occurred. From that point onward, his role shifted from intermediary to active participant in the concealment of a serious crime. The bodies of David Griffiths and Brett Flournoy were moved from the shooting location to reduce the risk of visible evidence. Blood was cleaned, and surfaces were wiped down in an effort to remove obvious forensic indicators that could attract attention if the property were later accessed by third parties. The cleaning was carried out systematically, indicating an awareness of the investigative risks involved. The bodies were then loaded into a Citroën Berlingo van. The vehicle was used as a temporary containment method for both transportation and concealment. Once the bodies were inside, the van was set on fire to destroy physical evidence, including biological material, ballistic traces, and identifiable features. Following the fire, Stone used heavy agricultural machinery to excavate a deep pit on his land. The remains of the burned van, along with the bodies inside, were placed into the pit and buried. The surface was then restored and disguised to resemble the surrounding terrain, reducing the likelihood of visual detection. The murder weapon was removed from the scene. No evidence suggested that the shotgun was retained or reused after the killings. Its disposal was intended to sever the direct link between the firearm and the shooter. Once the concealment process was complete, Thomas Hay left Cornwall and returned to Huddersfield, where he believed he could blend into a familiar environment and avoid attention. Ross Stone remained at the farm and resumed normal routines, maintaining the appearance of a landowner unconnected to the disappearance of 2 men. In the short term, the concealment proved effective. No witnesses reported gunshots. No outsiders identified irregularities at the farm. Sunny Corner Farm remained a blind spot within the local social and legal landscape. However, disposing of the bodies did not eliminate the consequences. 2 men had vanished from a criminal network they had actively operated within, and their absence soon created gaps that could not be concealed indefinitely. It was from these gaps that the formal investigation began to take shape. The disappearance of David Griffiths and Brett Flournoy could not remain concealed for long. Within days, the simultaneous loss of contact with family members, associates, and criminal partners raised a level of concern significant enough to draw attention. Formal missing persons reports were filed, compelling law enforcement to initiate an investigation. In its early stages, the case lacked a defined crime scene, direct witnesses, or overt indicators of violence. However, background assessments quickly eliminated the possibility of voluntary disappearance. Both Griffiths and Flournoy were actively involved in ongoing criminal operations that required their physical presence. Their sudden absence provided no strategic advantage to themselves or to the network in which they operated. Investigators turned to telecommunications data to reconstruct the men's final movements. Analysis showed that both mobile phone signals ceased within a narrow time window at the same location in Cornwall. The final known location was identified as Sunny Corner Farm, a property registered to Ross Stone. At that stage, Stone had no serious criminal record and appeared outwardly to be a reclusive farm owner. Nonetheless, the convergence of time and location placed his property at the center of the investigation. Stone was summoned for questioning as a witness. During initial interviews, Stone adopted a cooperative posture and denied any knowledge of the men's disappearance. However, inconsistencies emerged when his statements were compared against technical data and intelligence obtained from other individuals within the criminal network. As investigative pressure intensified, Stone began to acknowledge the extent of his involvement. He confirmed that both victims had been present at Sunny Corner Farm on June 16, 2011, and admitted to participating in the handling of the scene after they had been shot. Critically, Stone led police to the burial site on his own land. There, investigators discovered the remains of a burned van, along with evidence of human remains that had been incinerated and buried. This discovery formally shifted the case from a missing persons inquiry to a double homicide investigation. With the crime scene established, Stone's testimony became a central component of the case. He identified Thomas Hay as the shooter and admitted his own role in disposing of the bodies and removing evidence. While Stone denied involvement in planning the murders, he did not contest his participation in the concealment. Meanwhile, Thomas Hay had returned to Huddersfield, attempting to resume ordinary routines under the assumption that geographic distance and a lack of direct evidence would shield him from scrutiny. Investigators, however, rapidly correlated Stone's statements with communication records, travel data, and Hay's known associations. As these elements were assembled, Hay's role shifted from suspicion to focus. His arrest followed shortly thereafter, concluding the search phase and initiating formal criminal proceedings. What began as two seemingly disconnected missing persons reports evolved into the systematic exposure of a calculated double murder, carried out in silence, but not with sufficient precision to evade law enforcement indefinitely. By early 2012, the case proceeded to trial at Truro Crown Court. What had been buried at Sunny Corner Farm was now examined under the scrutiny of the criminal justice system. The central question before the court was no longer how the victims disappeared, but who bore criminal responsibility for their deaths, and to what extent. Thomas Hay was charged with 2 counts of murder. The prosecution argued that his actions satisfied all elements of premeditated homicide: a clear motive, a prolonged period of preparation, deliberate selection of location, and the use of a highly lethal weapon. The shootings were not the result of panic or self-defense, but the outcome of a calculated decision-making process. Ross Stone faced charges relating to the disposal of bodies and obstruction of justice. While he was not charged with murder, his role in cleaning the scene, burning the vehicle, and burying the remains constituted active participation in concealing a serious crime. At trial, the prosecution relied on a tightly connected chain of evidence. Telecommunications data established the victim's final location and time of disappearance. The burial site confirmed the use of a van and agricultural machinery during disposal. Stone's testimony, though self-serving, aligned with physical evidence recovered from the farm. Hay did not deny being present at Sunny Corner Farm on the day of the killings, but failed to provide any alternative explanation consistent with the evidence presented. There was no indication that the victims were armed or posed an immediate threat that could justify the use of lethal force. After several days of proceedings, the jury reached a verdict in a short deliberation period. Thomas Hay was found guilty on both counts of murder. In sentencing remarks, the judge described Hay as an individual drawn deeply into the criminal lifestyle, convinced that violence was an acceptable means of resolving disputes, and willing to act with sufficient coldness to take 2 lives. Hay was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 35 years before eligibility for parole. The sentence reflected both the severity of the crimes and the calculated nature of their execution. Ross Stone was acquitted of murder, but convicted of offenses related to disposing of the bodies and obstructing the investigation. He received a 5-year custodial sentence, though he served a reduced term under release provisions. The trial concluded the assignment of criminal liability, but it did not erase the consequences. 2 men were dead, 1 man would spend the majority of his life in prison, and another carried a permanent criminal conviction for choosing concealment over withdrawal. The case was formally closed within the judicial system. Its effects, however, extended beyond the courtroom. The Sunny Corner Farm case was formally closed in 2012 when sentences were handed down and the file was archived. In substance, however, the case was not an anomaly within the world its participants chose to enter. It was the logical outcome of a system built on violence, debt, and control through fear. David Griffiths and Brett Flournoy were not killed because of bad timing or a wrong location. They were killed because they exercised authority within a structure that offered no safe exit, where every debt carried an implicit death threat, and where weaker links could become liabilities once pushed beyond their limits. Their prior use of violence to enforce control did not grant immunity when the balance of power shifted. Thomas Hay was not acting in a moment of panic. The case record shows that his decision to kill followed a prolonged period of pressure within an environment where recourse to law enforcement did not exist. Context, however, does not alter the nature of the act. Hay chose homicide as a solution, and the legal system responded with a life sentence. Ross Stone represents a different role within the criminal ecosystem. An individual who did not pull the trigger but believed silence and post-defense assistance would provide protection. His case demonstrates how the boundary between non-involvement and complicity can be erased by a single decision to conceal. From an investigative standpoint, the case also illustrates the limitations of concealment through violence. Bodies can be buried and scenes can be cleaned, but the disappearance of operational figures within a criminal network inevitably leaves traces. Structural gaps, technical data, and relational links ultimately led investigators back to the point of origin. For the public, this is not a story about isolated mistakes or misfortune. It is a clear demonstration of how criminal systems function, without contracts, without risk protection, and without honorable exits. Relationships maintained through fear tend to end in betrayal, and violence used as a tool of control ultimately turns back on those who rely on it. The Sunny Corner Farm file closes with 3 outcomes: 2 men dead with no opportunity for correction, 1 man imprisoned for most of his life, and 1 man continuing on with a permanent conviction attached to his name. There were no winners, only a sequence of decisions, each narrowing the available paths until reversal was no longer possible. This is where the file ends. Not because the story ran out, but because every consequence has been formally confirmed by law.